This is Judaism Unbound, episode 475, Zionism and Anti-Zionism. What do they mean? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing to explore American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine. And we're especially excited today to have this conversation because it's about what Jews really mean when they use language that tends to push various people's buttons. Our guests today, Janet Krasner Aronson and Matthew Boxer, are social scientists who explore American Jewish life in their work. They know one another well and they work at the same university, but today we're in conversation with them about two different studies that they are working on independently. But we're exploring these two different studies together because, as you'll see, they're inherently in deep conversation with one another. Matthew Boxer's study is titled, What is Zionism? Assessing the Diversity of Discourse in a Charged Environment. This study was designed to assess how North American Jews interpret the meaning of some questions about Israel that are frequently asked on surveys. In other words, the study wants to discover what people really mean when they answer survey questions about Israel, which they did by having people answer survey questions and then asking them to explain in their own words why they chose the response that they chose. Janet Krasner Aronson's study, which hasn't been completed yet, surveyed self-identified Jewish anti-Zionists who are highly engaged in Jewish life religiously and culturally. She asked them about their attitudes about and their relationship to Israel-Palestine, meaning the state of Israel, the land, the people who live there, both Palestinian and Israeli, as well as their perspectives on Jewish diaspora. Before we begin, a quick reminder that courses in the Unyeshiva just started earlier this week as this episode is being released, but thanks to the miracle of digital technology, you can still sign up between now and when the second classes take place next week. You'll be able to hop into a time machine, also known as getting access to the video recording of the first class, and you'll be totally caught up before the second class. And since these are 8-session classes, there's no reason to miss out just because you're hearing about them for the first time right now. But don't wait, because registration will close after the second class. So head over to judaismunbound.com/classes to sign up for them. Financial aid is available for all of these classes, and it's easy to access it from a link on each registration page. And now a little bit more about our guest today. Matthew Boxer is an assistant research professor at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and the Steinhardt Social Research Institute at Brandeis University. He earned a Master of Arts in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University and a Master of Science and PhD in Sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where his doctoral dissertation focused on the effects of Jewish community size on Jewish identity. Matthew Boxer's research includes the sociodemography and social psychology of the Jewish community, altruistic behaviors and preferences, Israel, Zionism and anti-Zionism, formal and informal Jewish education, and anti-Semitism. Matthew Boxer is a member of the National Advisory Board of the Center for Small-Town Jewish Life at Colby College. In 2023, he received a Distinguished Early Career Award from the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry. Janet Krasner Aronson is the Associate Director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and the Steinhardt Social Research Institute at Brandeis University. Her primary research areas include local Jewish community studies, and she's directed studies in Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, Washington, D.C., Miami, and many other communities. She is interested in emerging trends in Jewish engagement and how best to measure, understand, and respond to these trends. Janet Krasner Aronson earned her PhD in social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis, where she examined the impact of Birthright Israel on the parents of the participants. Janet Krasner Aronson was a member of the first cohort of the Barnard College Jewish Theological Seminary double degree program, in which she earned bachelor's degrees in computer science and Bible. So let's find out what Jews really mean when they talk about Israel-Palestine. Janet Krasner Aronson, Matthew Boxer, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Happy to be here.
Great. Well, I am so excited about this episode. Lex and I were just talking offline before the episode. On a nerdery level, we are the most excited probably about this episode. Our listeners might imagine that some of the other topics are sexier, but for us, this is a very sexy topic. And I'll tell you why, for me, in addition to a just sort of love of surveys and demography. I have been feeling very strongly, and we've talked about this in this series, that the discourse is not being served by the framing that we seem to be offered and most people seem to have accepted being a fight between Zionists and anti-Zionists. What does that mean? What are we really talking about? And I've said this before, but my wife had this idea that there should be a game of taboo where you're not allowed to say certain words, and we should have to have discussions about Israel and Palestine without being able to say a whole host of words, because maybe then we would be talking about what we're really talking about instead of just hyper reacting to some word that somebody used that actually they have two different definitions of. So I'm wondering if you could describe briefly for our listeners, what is the research that you've been undertaking that is kind of getting at some of the raw material that we might use to have this conversation about how might we enrich the discourse?
So for years, I've been having conversations with journalists and with the various Jewish communities that our research team works with about survey questions about Israel. In essence, there are questions that pop up on lots of different surveys that we conduct, surveys that other research groups conduct, that get twisted to fit certain ideological positions or that get misinterpreted because people present them as meaning something other than the exact language of the question. And there's also an issue of, does the question mean the same thing to the respondents as it does to the people asking the question? Survey questions really work best when we all agree on the meaning of the question and the response options. And we tend to ask the same questions the same way from survey to survey to facilitate measurement of change over time and comparison between populations. But what happens if the meaning of the questions themselves change over time, or if not everyone in the respondent pool interprets the question the same way? What does it mean if we ask somebody, do you describe yourself as a Zionist? Does that mean the same thing to the four of us on this call? Does it mean the same thing to the people who were asking to complete our surveys? Does it mean the same thing today as it meant 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago? And if the questions are hitting differently for the respondents, researchers have to know that so we can assess whether it should affect our interpretation of the data. But I didn't think anyone had done such an assessment, certainly in my lifetime. And so I decided just to educate myself better so I would know a little bit more about the people I'm asking to complete my surveys and understand better how they're interpreting these questions. I was going to do something that we call a cognitive test. A cognitive test is a basic tool in any social scientist's toolbox. You basically put together a mini survey where you ask the questions that you want to ask on your survey. You bring in a few dozen people, you ask them the questions, and you ask them to tell you, what do you think that question meant? How did you interpret it? What did it mean to you? And based on their responses, if they're all consistent, you have a pretty good question. You can ask it to a population that is similar to these people, and you have a pretty good idea how your respondents will participate. But if they're all over the place, if they have very different understandings of what it is that you're asking, you might need to tweak your question. You might need to ask something slightly different. You might need to introduce it in a slightly different way, or you might just need to scrap the question and come up with something else altogether. And so I figured I'll ask a couple hundred people, see what I get, find out what is the variation in the way people interpret some of these commonly asked survey questions about Israel. And I ended up with 1,854 people telling me how they understood the four questions that I ended up testing. It comes out to a couple thousand pages of notes. I had to go through and code all of them with my team and try to figure out what is the diversity of understandings of these four questions. That's really the project that I'm working on. It's been almost 3 years now, and I've still just scratched the surface because the ways that people understand what is Zionism, what is connection to Israel, these are not items that exist in nature. We have built them up. We have created these meanings out of, in some cases, nowhere, and we don't all agree on what they mean. There are multiple definitions of these terms, but we need to understand what they are. We need to understand what definitions are accepted in the Jewish community and which are more contentious, partly so that we can have better discourse, so that we can talk to each other about them rather than screaming past each other, which unfortunately is a theme about Israel in the Jewish community today.
Janet, tell us a little bit about your work, your recent work.
So my work was driven actually more by my orientation as being an active member of the Jewish community with very complex family, with a whole range of religious and political orientations. And I wanted to see how I could bring my research skills to bear into sort of unpacking some of these issues. And this specific question was about anti and non-Zionists, and what I hear in the community about, it's like mainstream Jewish community, much of the mainstream Jewish community, assumptions that Jewish anti-Zionists are either completely disconnected from their Judaism or they're completely uneducated, ignorant. Often I've heard the line, well, we need to just tell these young people about the Holocaust. And in my experience, talking to the anti-Zionists that I know and love, many of them are far more knowledgeable about the history of Israel-Palestine, about political discourse, than I am and that I will ever be. And many of them are highly religiously engaged, highly Jewishly engaged, many of them starting up anti-Zionist minyanim and organizations, religious, cultural. We cannot dismiss this group of people. They are really important. And one particular conversation that sparked this was an observation from somebody that I know that many, if not most, of the non-Orthodox rabbinical students in the country are probably, somewhere on the anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, questioning Zionist spectrum. And I said, okay, maybe it's not many, maybe it's not most, but it's certainly some. And what does that mean?
It's a lot for what it's anecdotally as a rabbi in that category. It's a lot.
Yes, it's a lot. Okay, we're going to say it's a lot. So what does this mean for the future of the American Jewish community if the most engaged Jewish leadership is shifting so far from this mainstream normative view about Zionism? So that was the impetus to do this work. And then I said, as a researcher, what do I do to answer some of those questions? I began, because I personally know a number of people in this space, I started off with a series of interviews, just talking to them about what they meant by anti-Zionism. How did they come to those views? Everybody that I talked to, nearly everybody, grew up deeply immersed in the sort of Jewish American narrative, although some were Israeli, and how their views evolved over time to take their views about Israel-Palestine, where they are currently, the conflicts that are caused with Jewish institutions, with their families, with their friends. And how do they balance, how do they sort of hold love of Judaism, love of perhaps the land of Israel, understanding that the land of Israel is clearly central. It's a central motif in Jewish life. So how do you hold that space as a deeply connected Jewish person? How do you understand all of these? How do you put together a Jewish identity? So I started with a number of interviews. I think I did about 10. And then I started getting requests from people like, I want to be, can I do an interview? And truthfully, I'm doing this it's not part of my normal work activities. So I'm doing it on my own, and I couldn't quite carve the time out to do all those interviews. So I decided to do a survey that got at some of those same questions, not in the same depth. And I put it out through the networks of the people I had interviewed and other folks about their views, and I got about 800 responses of all of people who said that the criteria were highly Jewishly engaged, whatever that means to you, and non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, or some similar position, whatever that means to you. One of the things that was interesting is I said I wanted younger adults, like up to age 40, which is where I was originally thinking. But I got quite a few responses from older people who said, "Can I still take your survey?" And I said, "Of course." It reminds me, this is not a new issue. It sometimes feels like it's a new issue, and I think there are certain things that are new to this moment, but it's not new, and it doesn't just affect, the young people. So I did the survey, and I'm just working my way through the amazing things that I'm learning about the Jewish identity of the people that responded, a lot of their Jewish background, and as well their answers to this question: what is your position on Israel? How do you relate to the land of Israel and the people of Israel? And I'll just throw in, to complicate things more, this issue of relationship to Israel and Palestine is, of course, related to the discussions about anti-Semitism. So I also asked them about their views about anti-Semitism. Have they experienced anti-Semitism in their political spaces, and from the left, from the right, and how do they understand it? And it's very interesting. What a thoughtful group of people that I've just had the privilege of talking to. I have learned so much, and frankly, had to push past a lot of my emotional barriers.
I'm glad you built in a phrase, emotional barriers, because the question I have next is about emotional attachment. Mm-hmm. And so this gets, Matt, back in your wheelhouse. For listeners, we're gonna go back and forth between these two studies, which are not the same, but are certainly worth experiencing in conversation with one another. But emotional attachment. Matt, I'm going to share my longtime experience as somebody who has been a participant in some Jewish surveys and broader surveys. There's a video presentation that's in our show notes where you talk about your recent work, and it was so validating for me because there's a part where you talk about this phrase, emotional attachment to Israel, and that this is a question that has been asked across hundreds of surveys. To what extent do you feel an emotional attachment to Israel? Do you feel a strong attachment? Do you feel no attachment? All of those kinds of things. I'm getting certain words off, but emotional attachment is there. And I truly have like an existential moment every time I encounter this, because I go in and I'm like, well, objectively, if you look at all humans on the planet, I have more emotional things, different emotions, but many emotions around Israel or Israel-Palestine, but usually it's asked about Israel. I just objectively, I think about it more. I have more of my life embroiled in emotional feelings about it: happy, sad, anger, frustration, confusion. If I'm being honest, I need to say yes, or strong, like I have a strong attachment. But at the same time, there's a part of me that senses that maybe the purpose of that question is, would I describe myself as somebody who, quote unquote, loves Israel or feels a specific emotional attachment that is positive? I think that because I know a lot of organizations receive these studies afterwards and they generally channel them to show, oh, look, whatever percent has an emotional attachment to Israel, and that means this percent loves Israel. Meanwhile, I've said, yes, I have an emotional attachment, or I have a deep emotional attachment, because I feel like that's honest. If I have anger towards a place, if I have frustration with a place, that's an emotion, but it's being channeled in a way that doesn't feel honest. So can you talk to us a little bit about that languaging, and more broadly, how your recent work is helping us understand the ways those questions might be misleading?
Since 1990, most surveys of North American Jewish communities that include questions about Israel have asked some iteration of this same question: how emotionally attached are you to Israel? The original question had the response options: not at all attached, somewhat attached, very attached, or extremely attached. There's some variations in exactly how that's asked, but the stem is the same: how emotionally attached are you to Israel? The question was originally written for the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, and it was intended to assess respondents' sense of connection to the modern state of Israel. But as written, it could refer to lots of other things. It could be the people of Israel, it could be the land of Israel. And so fundamentally, like, what Israel are people hearing when they hear this question? And it could even be, and this is something that my respondents really get into in depth, it could be that you have absolutely no connection to the state of Israel, but you have tremendous love and affection and connection to Israelis. If what you're interpreting Israel to mean is the people of the state of Israel, then I feel a tremendous amount of attachment. I feel extremely attached. But if you're talking about the Israeli government, the people who rule the state today, I feel not at all attached. That happens frequently. And so on balance, it seems to be interpreted as a measure of, do you feel any sort of connection to Israel, the state of Israel, but not necessarily the government of Israel? It could be the people of Israel. It could be the land. It could be the history of the Jewish people in that land, but it's not necessarily the state itself, as was originally intended by the people who wrote the question 35 years ago. But we have never tested that before. And that, again, was really why I put this study together. As you go through people's responses, it's clear that they have very different ideas of what is, what should come first there. So here's one person who says, when prominent people in Israel, governmental or otherwise, denigrate the importance of the diaspora and the commitment of Jews living outside of Israel, it presents a barrier to feeling emotionally attached. So this is someone who feels connected to Israel or wants to feel connected to Israel, but they feel like there's something of a one-way relationship here, where we in the diaspora are expected to display emotional attachment, to feel unconditional support for the state of Israel, even when we don't agree with its policies, when we don't agree with its actions, when we feel that they have mistreated us or other people. And then you get very different reactions from other respondents. You have some people who talk about, here's another one, I am conflicted about Israel. Well, I will always defend Israel. Like anywhere else, it has significant problems, not the least of which is how it treats the Palestinian people and the occupied territories, and to a much lesser degree, how Israeli Arabs are treated. You get people who talk about people who see Israel as a safe haven for Jewish people have an easier time feeling attached to it than those who do not think Jews are threatened. So you have some people for whom the most important aspect of this question of emotional attachment is this feeling they have that Israel is necessary as a refuge for Jewish people around the world. And so these are just a few examples of the different ways people are interpreting emotional attachment, but there are dozens of ways people are interpreting this question, some of which overlap with each other in key ways, and others that are diametrically opposed to each other. It's not just how many people say that they're extremely attached and how many people say they're not at all attached to Israel. Even within those seemingly diametrically opposite responses, you get people who talk about Israel in the same ways. And that, for me, is fascinating.
First of all, I'm having a lot of feelings, in this just listening to you talk. Just thinking about even the person who says, I think Israel's necessary because of the Holocaust. I don't necessarily read that as a person who necessarily loves Israel or feels emotionally attached to Israel in the way that we usually mean it. It's kind of like saying, I don't know, like I own a store and there's a lot of shoplifting and I have a security guard at the door and, I have to because otherwise people are going to steal my stuff. That's very different from I have a brother who is a security guard at a store and I love him so deeply because both of those cases might say, yeah, I'm kind of in favor of that security guard existing, but for profoundly different reasons. And I think it matters in the end. And that the sort of communal languaging is kind of like doesn't distinguish, says, well, they're all on the same side, right? They all want the security guard to keep on going. So they must be aligned.
No, absolutely. And that one respondent I happen to know because I looked at all of their other responses to the questions. They really do feel the way that I presented that quote, that Israel is necessary because of the Holocaust and because of other threats to Jewish people around the world. But there are plenty of other people in the data set who feel that it is important for Israel to exist as a refuge for the Jewish people, who also feel, and you can see that this in the cross tabulations of some of our other surveys as well, that Israel does not live up to its obligations to Arab and Palestinian citizens and to other minority populations within the country. That Israel can simultaneously be a refuge for Jewish people without meaning that it needs to be only for the Jewish people, or that it only needs to treat Jewish people well and can afford to or be allowed to mistreat everyone else.
I have a different response to this question about the emotional attachment, which is what I think informed part of my research. One of the ways of understanding that question is, as long as people are emotionally attached to Israel, they can object to Israel all they want. They could object to Israel's policies. We're worried about just being distant, being, out of the removing yourself from the conversation. And one of the things that I wanted to look at was if people were saying, I didn't ask specifically that question about emotional attachment, but when people were taking these anti-Israel positions, did that mean that they were really attached to Israel and feeling like, as a Jewish person, I had an obligation to protest against Israel's policies out of a sense of attachment? Or was it just really distancing? Israel's not going to be part of my Jewish life. And I saw that both, there were plenty of examples of both, but I think what was particularly new to, sort of a new concept to me, although not new to many, is this idea of the revival of diasporism. The idea is we want to create a Judaism, or we want to recreate, invigorate a Judaism within the United States, within the diaspora, where Israel is not central. Yes, I can be attached, but Israel, this love of Israel has become a central pillar in Jewish identity and Jewish education. And it's explicit. My education, my children's education. First, we have to teach them to love Israel, and then we can do everything else. And I think that this attachment question is trying to tap into that, putting everything else aside, putting all of these political objections. Do I love Israel? Did that education work? And I would say for many of the people that I spoke with, they don't love Israel. They may love the people. They may love individuals because they have family and friends there. They may love the land. The modern nation state of Israel is a whole other thing that they don't see as central to Judaism. And they want to create a Judaism that is about their lives. And the revival of Yiddish culture, I think, is a part of this. And creating other institutions, other rituals, other ways of having meaningful Jewish life in the United States. That was something I really learned from this research, that how that all connects. And it is kind of a detachment from Israel. And I think that's another way of understanding that are you attached to Israel question, the state of Israel.
So I'm really interested in what we've sort of begun to unearth here. I think in math terms all the time. And I think part of what comes up with emotional attachment is almost the question of, if I were going to ask somebody, this is going to sound weird to everybody who doesn't think like me, which is greater, the number 10 or the number -15? Well, the number 10 is a higher number. If you're thinking about, negative infinity into infinity, 10 is a bigger number. But if you're thinking about absolute value, the math notion of like which has a greater magnitude, -15 has a greater magnitude. And so if your relationship to Israel is very deep, but channeled in a way where you spend a lot of your life frustrated with it, that's where you start to see that. Now, there are also people who they're -1 or -2. Like they don't think much about Israel, but to the extent they do, it's like they don't like it so much. So that's just a comment by me. I want to go to Janet and ask, I love the way you've mentioned your own learning process through what these respondents have brought in your work, these highly engaged, either anti or non-Zionist Jews, and how they frame their anti or non-Zionism. I looked a little bit at some of your initial work. It's not public yet, but I saw that your process, you had people who self-identified as highly engaged Jewishly and also non and anti-Zionist. And then within that group, you actually picked the ones that were the most extra engaged in almost every kind of Jewish activity. Go to services, like do Shabbat stuff, might have a kosher practice. And so truly what we're left with is like a hyper involved, and I'm using the word involved, which we've problematized in other contexts, because what do you mean by involved? Which kind of Jewish involvement? But here, like, it's actually a group that seems to meet almost any definition of how one would define Jewish engagement. And they're expressing directly, and in my view, very articulately in the responses I've said, that they are not Zionists, and in many cases, that their anti or non-Zionism, it's not opposed to their Jewishness. It's an outgrowth of their Jewishness. That's the piece that I don't know that folks fully understand, because they're stuck in that attachment notion where they think if somebody is criticizing Israel, if somebody has as a core part of their identity something starting with anti and related to Israel, so anti-Zionism, how on earth could that be an outgrowth of Jewish feeling? But I'd love to kind of ask that non-rhetorically to you. How are your respondents articulating their connections to Israel-Palestine, their connections to desires for a better world? I'm not going to say even as they're anti-Zionists, because that implies somehow the opposite is more intuitive. But while they are anti-Zionist or non-Zionist?
I think that is the heart of what I'm trying to understand myself. And in the data that I share with you, I did pick out the most involved Jews by some arbitrary definition, just to make sure that I could focus on their perception. So one way that I think we might imagine that Jews would answer this question, especially less involved Jews, would be that sort of tikkun olam Judaism, the repairing the world, that Judaism is all about Jewish values. And so the way the Israelis are treating the Palestinians does not align with my Jewish values, and that's why I object to Israel. That is certainly true of many Jewish people who object to Israel, whether they're Zionists or not. They talk a lot about these Jewish values. That is not the case with this group of people. It is much deeper and more thoughtful. And I think it gets into really their deep notions. One idea that comes across is Judaism is about God, Torah, Jewish law, all of these things. It is not about having a political state. And this political state that claims to speak for me is really problematic. So it's not coming out of this values message. It has really come from their understanding of what Judaism truly is, and this political view that of what the modern state of Israel is. It's not I don't talk too much about the messianic view of Israel, but it's not the Israel of the Torah. So that's like another religious view of Israel, that this is absolutely the Messiah coming and enacted through the Jewish state. So there are obviously religious Jews, Neturei Karta, who say that that's the problem with Israel as a religious person, is that this is made by man and we need to we have to wait for the Messiah to do this. So this is not, but it is a deeply held religious view about what Judaism really is and what it is to them. And that for 2,000 years, Judaism has been a diaspora religion, and it works pretty well. I think the other thing is, and I mentioned earlier about anti-Semitism, their view of Jewish safety, and their view of how Israel, in fact, does not contribute to Jewish safety. And I will say I don't want to speak too much about that because I don't really fully understand the argument. But I will say this, acknowledge that after the Holocaust, the Jewish world had a huge problem. Where were the survivors going to go? Nobody else was going to take them in. Many people, and many of them talk about their grandparents were Holocaust survivors. They have these stories, but they say that if Israel is supposed to be a refuge for the Jewish people, that doesn't need to be at the expense of the Palestinians. It can be both. It goes beyond the current moment. One question I asked is, how did your views change on October 7th? And most of them said they didn't. This was not something like I got a wake-up call on October 7th. These are views that they've had for a long time, and they really think deeply about the founding of the State of Israel and the fundamental premises and its relationship to the Palestinians.
Janet, I just want to note that I think you just said one of my favorite things that I've ever heard said on our podcast, which is I don't really understand the full argument of these folks, but I respect that there's an argument there because I talk to them. And in some ways, that is very much one of the big messages that I took away from our last series of conversations about Israel-Palestine, which was that we should stop redlining. We should stop pushing people out of the community. We should listen to each other. And I would give exactly the same message to my friends on the left and to say, like, I would love for you to be able to say, I don't quite understand the argument, but I'm talking to people on the right. You know, I'm really trying to understand what's going on here. But I so wish that the wider community could be able to have this approach. So I say that sort of parenthetically. What I wanted to ask you, sort of on a more professional level, is, okay, so you have the privilege of being able to step back and take the time and have these conversations. What is the kind of so what of it as far as you see it? What you're both saying is like, hey, we kind of have a polarized situation here where the Zionists think that the anti-Zionists are trying to destroy Israel, and the anti-Zionists think that the Zionists are trying to commit a genocide. That most people don't have those views on the two sides. Most people who call themselves a Zionist do not want to wipe out the Palestinians, and most people who call themselves a non-Zionist or an anti-Zionist do not want to see Israel destroyed in violence and all the Jews there be killed. But yet that is the caricature that I think that a lot of the spokespeople on both sides give of the other side. And so your work has the capacity to put a lot of nuance in that. But then I think the question is, what do we do next? Because now, how do we talk? Because these words don't mean anything. So how do we talk in ways that we ultimately have to make progress in our society? And now we know that anti-Zionist and Zionist doesn't mean what you think it meant. Okay, so now what do we do? And how does this kind of work contribute to that? Or what would be your sort of impulse on what next polling or interviewing do we need to do in order to try to find ways to have these conversations?
So I think this intersects with a lot of the other work that Matt and I do about just trying to understand the Jewish community. When we do studies of a Jewish community, we try to understand that there is so much diversity. And this word diversity, which is kind of a buzzword, is not just about age and background, but this has touched so many issues. Changing views about intermarried families, changing views about institutional Judaism versus non-institutional Judaism. And I put all of these under the umbrella of who's in the tent and who's out. And I think that this is going to be a conversation forever. I often ask myself, why is this the litmus test issue right now? Why are we completely fine with Jews who don't believe in God, don't follow any Jewish law, and there is no question that they are Jewish? Nobody's asking that. Why does this seem to be the issue of the moment, the litmus test? If we want to look at the future of the Jewish community, look towards a future, we have to recognize the fear on both sides. And I think it is so much driven by fear. And as I said, I started to have a lot of these conversations, and I've had to identify this myself. Many people have talked about this, the post-traumatic syndrome, the intergenerational trauma of after the Holocaust. And I think that that's really true. And that was absolutely triggered by October 7th. I couldn't believe, for me personally, I couldn't believe how much that was triggered. And that was when I started this work, shortly after that. How could you be an anti-Zionist on October 8th? And I learned a lot. I really learned a lot, but I think we have to have those conversations. And I have listened to a lot of speakers talk about how to have those conversations. And one thing I would say is one I listened to recently that really struck me. Somebody was giving us a talk about how to talk to your children and grandchildren who are anti-Zionists and straying from the path. And this speaker said, you are not going to change their mind by sending them an article. So that was true. But what he didn't move away from is they are wrong, you are right, and eventually the goal is eventually that you want to change their mind. Or come to some impasse. This is your child, this is your grandchild. I love them, so I have to be able to sit at Seder with them. So we have to decide, we're just not going to talk about this. And that's coming up in so many areas of life, of American politics, Jewish politics, and so forth. If we want to be a Jewish community, that's not a community. That's it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we do have to learn to do it. And hopefully some of this work will help alleviate some of the fear of having these conversations.
My question is to Matt, and it's about my favorite moment in a presentation you gave about your research. You are talking about one of your 4 questions, not the Passover 4 questions, but the 4 questions you look deeply into about how people interpret them. You're looking at the apartheid state question. And basically there's a common question about to what extent do people agree or disagree with the statement Israel is an apartheid state. You put on the screen a response from somebody who said, I strongly agree. I think that Israel is an apartheid state. And their only response was, this is obvious. Explanation not necessary. That's all they said. And then there is next to them somebody who said, I strongly disagree. Israel is definitely not an apartheid state. And they had the exact same verbatim word choice. This is obvious. Explanation not necessary. Can you talk to us about that specific question and also what it reflects more generally about these different interpretations?
Yeah, those responses, and they came in on the same day. I mean, it was kismet. That was when I knew I really had something here worth sharing with the world. If it's so obvious that no explanation is necessary, why did these 2 respondents have the complete opposite answers to the question? What it really comes down to is they have different definitions of what apartheid is. The next question, I asked them to explain what it means to describe a country as an apartheid state. And so across the totality of the 1,800 and something respondents to my survey, it becomes clear there are lots of different definitions of what makes a state an apartheid state. And they seem to fall into a few main categories. For one group of people, Israel is an apartheid state because it treats Israelis, it treats Jews, and it treats Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, whoever, differently. For some of my respondents, that's not evidence of apartheid. That's evidence of racism of the same sort that exists in the United States and in Canada and in Germany and in South Africa and in virtually every other country around the world. But for some of my respondents, that difference means that Israel is an apartheid state. For some of my respondents, they look at conditions in Israel proper and on the other side of the Green Line in the West Bank, and they say these are 2 different legal systems. Israel is imperfect, but it's not an apartheid state. But in the West Bank, where there are two different legal systems, where there's military occupation, where the Palestinians are treated as not even second-class citizens, but not as citizens at all, that's an apartheid society. The people who are saying this are largely not people who are opposed to the state of Israel. They're largely not anti-Zionists. These are sort of your standard issue, left center American Jews who don't want to think of Israel in this light, but they look at the conditions on the ground, and for moral reasons, they're saying this is wrong. And I have a third group who draw direct parallels to international law or to the apartheid regime in South Africa. They look at the UN Convention on apartheid and the crime of apartheid. They pull out the specific language and they say, this is what Itamar Ben-Gvir says should be the policy, and see how that is the same. This is what Israel is doing in Israel, not just in the West Bank, but in Israel proper. And that is the same as the language that is displayed here in this UN convention. They look at the Rome Statute. They do the same thing. And they're saying, if this is international law that clearly defines apartheid, and you see these exact same conditions in Israel, that's an apartheid state. And the fourth group, and it, on some level, terrifies me that I have these people in my data set. But on another level, I'm glad they're there because I know these people exist, and it is important to acknowledge that they exist, no matter how strongly I disagree with them. I have Kahanists in my data set. I have people who say, yes, of course, Israel is an apartheid state. We want more apartheid. And these people they're part of the Jewish community. And because they identify as Zionists, they often get a free pass. They support Israel, therefore they are our allies. One of the messages that I gave to the ADL was that, if you're going to take this stance that Zionism is good and anti-Zionism is bad, and worse, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you need to know that there are Zionists out there who fall into a category that until very recently were categorized here in the United States and in Israel as a terrorist group. These should not be your allies. And if you want to look at the people who say that Israel is an apartheid state, some of them are Zionists who want the best for Israel, who are saying this not because they approve, not because they hate Jews, not because they hate Israel, but because they want Israel to do better. It's a big part of the reason why we have all of this conflict in the Jewish community around Israel. And yet, circling back to these two respondents, when one strongly agrees that Israel is an apartheid state and the other strongly disagrees, and when asked to explain why they feel that way, they both wrote exactly, it's obvious, no explanation is necessary. We need to have these conversations with each other about why it's maybe not so obvious. I don't know, maybe I'm comfortable with this because I'm an agnostic Jew who is Shomer Shabbat, Shomer Kashrut, religiously observant. And to me, that is perfectly normative within Judaism. But to other people, it just sounds nuts. How can those two things possibly exist together? But I'm used to not agreeing with other people and still wanting to understand where they're coming from, partly because that's my job and partly because Judaism in all of its many manifestations fascinates me, even when it's not my Judaism. If you look at Pew's 2020 survey, which I know you've talked about a lot in many episodes on this podcast, Pew asked 10 items. To what extent do you think that this is important to being a Jew, or do you think that this is essential to being a Jew? And there's a table in their report where they show the proportions of American Jews who said that these things are essential to Judaism. No one takes issue with someone who says the most essential thing to being Jewish is observing halakha, Jewish religious law. And yet that ranked 10th. It was all the way at the bottom of the list. Many people have a problem with making Judaism all about remembering the Holocaust. And yet that was number 1 on the list. Caring about Israel was number 6. Why is this the litmus test? I don't know, but I don't like litmus tests for hardly anything. I think we should have as few litmus tests as possible for inclusion in the Jewish
It's
community.
okay for blood sugar, though.
Yeah, for blood sugar, fine. For medical purposes, fine. But for inclusion in the community, for ability to participate comfortably in our community, it's not okay.
Well, by the way, I don't want to get letters from doctors as I'm reflecting. I think maybe a litmus test is for blood acidity. But anyway, doctors out there, there are medical appropriate uses for litmus tests, but not in political discourse. I wanted to just kind of take a piece that I noticed in your research, Matt, but this is really for you too, Janet, and just to reflect on your profession, essentially. And I love the research that you've done and the way you've gone about it. And, I certainly don't want to put you in an awkward position of, criticizing other colleagues, certainly not by name. But it's occurring to me as we talk about this that as wonderful as your research is, there's terrible danger in other research that's out there that is doing this kind of survey work. And Matt, I recall seeing this in your survey that you talked about this, that, there are surveys that show that 95% of Jews, I think, are supposedly Zionists. And one of the reasons...
They're interpreted that way.
Interpreted that way. And one of the reasons like this is dangerous to me, I'm reflecting upon, what recently happened in the U.S. elections. I think because a binary is imposed on us, where you're either Democrats or Republicans in this country, and no one else can really win, those two groups start to believe that that's true, and that everybody is either a Democrat or a Republican. And it turns out that that's not correct. It turns out that there is a wide span of people, and actually on both extremes, they're actually not Democrats and Republicans. That there's a far left and a far right that are actually not Democrats or Republicans, and you can't necessarily rely on them. And certainly the people kind of in the middle. And I think the sort of triumphalism of both parties that I've seen is that, we're in this game of tug of war, and eventually we'll get the majority, and then everybody's going to be us and we'll win. And the reality is that if there's inflation, you're going to lose. And I think that the mainstream Jewish community has fallen into the same trap. And I worry for both of them. I mean, I worry for those who love Israel that they are asserting things that are not true in an effort to try to say that everybody agrees with us. And frankly, I worry for those I love on the left that are sort of triumphantly saying, there are more of us than you think. And I feel like our demography is failing us in being able to identify that reality. And if that's not a reality, tell me so. But I think that your research says that is a reality. And so I guess I'm wondering how the field of Jewish demography can be better able to provide perhaps the unwelcome information to the people paying for it that says, actually it's a lot more complicated than you think, and there's probably no easy solution.
Yeah, I think that's kind of our starting point with every survey we conduct. There is no easy answer. The first place we start with every community is these demographic surveys that you see in communities all over the country are essentially an inch deep and a mile wide, because every community has 30 different topics they want to know about, but you can't keep people involved in taking a survey for that long. You can't spend 10 minutes on every topic. In fact, I've told more than one community, if we asked every question on the survey that you possibly want to ask of the people in your community, you will get 0 responses. And that's not useful. The end result is this balancing act where we try to get a little bit of information on every topic that is important for them to know about, and we try to prioritize the topics about which they have to have information from a representative sample of the community in order to serve the community. The next priority below that, information that would be useful to have in serving the community, but is not necessarily the most essential. And then if there's room for it on the survey, we can ask questions that would be interesting, but you don't necessarily know how you're going to use it. The things that are most important to know, such as this entire conversation has been about what does it mean for people to be attached to Israel or to describe themselves as Zionists or non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. You're not going to get that from a series of multiple choice questions. You have to talk to people. You have to listen to people. You have to have conversations with people. And in particular, you have to have conversations with people who think about the issues differently than you do. the surveys that we do, that other research teams do, that focus on the demographics and sort of the 30,000-foot view of the community, in the best done studies and the communities that are most thoughtful about using these studies for the benefit of the community, that's step one. You have to do more work beyond that. You have to dig a little bit deeper in the areas that are most important to you. And if that's not the approach that research teams are taking, if we're just doing research for the sake of paying our own salaries, I think that's not why we got into this work. We're not interested in just making a living. We want to make the Jewish community stronger for varying definitions of Jewish community and stronger.
So I think that the question that you asked raises a fundamental issue that's not specific to the Jewish community, and it has to do with the quality of research and how it gets out there. There's a lot of bad information out there, that the research that's not valid. And so people have grown to be really suspicious of everything that they read. And they say, well, this survey says this survey says the opposite. And then they throw up their hands and say, well, they're all true, or none are true, or my opinion is just as valid as all of those other opinions. The research that we do, I think it's excellent research. And we still run into problems that we present results and people say, I don't believe it. That can't be right, because it's not consistent with my experience. And this is a very hard problem. When they know that there is bad research out there, and they're not researchers. They're Jewish community professionals and lay leaders. And they can't look at our methodology and make any kind of scientific evaluation of our quality versus someone else's quality. I really feel for people. It's a very hard position to be in. But I will say this, that one thing that I am committed to is when we ask a question on a survey, we have to report the results. I give so much credit to communities that are willing, and not just, this is not just community studies, that are willing to ask really hard questions. And there was one, I think I'm not going to talk about specific communities, but there are some communities that have asked a question, do you consider yourself a Zionist? And that's a very brave question, because they were told, the results of this question are going in your report. And they were willing to do it. And there was one community where we asked a similar question, and in the end, they essentially wouldn't let us publish it. That was my first and last time doing that. Very challenging as a relatively new researcher to have that experience. But research can really help to shape a conversation. If people just say, this is describing who we are, and people trust it. And I think that, as I said, that gets into an issue of trusting research, trusting science. But I think we have had some really wonderful partners in this work who have really been trying to be open and learning. And I think often in the face of opposition from their communities, where we know this is going to be a hard question, not everybody will like it. So I really shout out to them.
Thank you both so much, Matt Boxer and Janet Krasner Aronson, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. It's been fascinating.
Thank you for having us.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again with us in the future. Before we close things out, there's a big thing. Our Yeshiva courses, they have just begun. The first class happened. They are 8 sessions long. It's not too late, because you can sign up now, watch the recording of the first week, and then be joining for the rest of the classes. But that will not be possible after 2 classes have happened. So you gotta go now, judaismunbound.com/classes, sign up for one of our awesome 8-week courses, catch up, and then you'll be off to the races. There's financial aid available, and we hope that you will explore these awesome opportunities. With that, we're going to close out this conversation and encourage you to be in touch with us. There are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Instagram handles. Both of those are @JudaismUnbound. You can visit our website, JudaismUnbound.com, and check out show notes for this episode where you can see Matt Boxer and Janet Krasner Aronson's work. You can visit the rest of our website and explore all our cool resources. Lots of goodies there. And you can, of course, email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We love receiving your notes, your feedback, your questions, your visions, whatever you've got. The last thing we'd say is that we're deeply appreciative if you're able to support us financially on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift, which you can do at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.